Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. In this, our fourth season, we're looking at Kenneth Branagh's 2011 film, Thor. I'm Matthew Fox from theethicalpanda.com.
And I'm Andy Nelson from the Next Reel Film Podcast.
Happy Thursday, Andy. Today we're talking about Minute 4, which begins with concern that Thor is dead and ends with Anthony Hopkins telling us a story. What grabbed you about this minute?
This is definitely a bifurcated minute, right? We have kind of the end of the last scene, or the scene we're currently looking at, where they've just hit somebody with their vehicle, and now there's some concern about what happened, and then where did he come from? And then we kind of go into this past story. We're kind of looking at kind of a historical flashback, if you will. And so I think that's what I find interesting, is that it really feels like we're at a point now where we're going to do some setting of the stage.
The thing I think that really grabbed me is we had just talked about how so much of this is about the world of science is scientifically discovering this world that seems mystical, but we're being scientists about it. And then one of the first things that Odin says, the Anthony Hopkins voice says, is, there once was a time when humanity accepted the truth, which is interesting because we stopped, quote unquote, accepting that truth because of the advance of science. And so I thought that was just kind of a fun little juxtaposition. And we're going to get into that, but let's have a quick moment first.
Want to wear some Marvel Movie Minute inspired clothing? Maybe looking for a mug with our logo on it? Find what you're looking for at our online store. Just head to truestory.fm/Marvel Movie Minute and click on merch.
We literally begin with Jane kind of seeing Thor, and she gets that great line, please don't be dead, which I think is kind of a fun, I don't think you could see that in a very selfish way. I don't think she means it in that way, but it is that kind of her concern is oh God, this is going to be really bad for me if you're dead, which I think is kind of a fun moment for her.
Although from Darcy's perspective, her comment is, I think that was legally your fault.
Yes. Yeah. Even more so the literally passing the buck of who, we're not throwing someone under the van. We're saying who's responsible for someone else getting thrown under the van.
Right.
The thing that really struck out at me, and we're later going to have a guest on, and we're going to talk a lot about the female gaze and the male gaze and how this movie avoids a lot of the kind of male gaze tropes and what all that means. But I think it's interesting, therefore, that this is the first time we're seeing Thor, but we're not really seeing him. We're seeing him in the background of the shot. We're not seeing the distinctive features of Chris Hemsworth's face. What we're seeing is Jane's reaction to him and her having this kind of moment of at first she's so concerned, are you dead? And then clearly there's something that happens to her because she has this moment of just almost wonder, it's not quite just the thirst moment of wow, this guy's really hot. It's there's something different about this moment. What was kind of your feeling on having us introduced to Thor through Jane's eyes in such a powerful way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting direction that they chose to take here, where we never see him. And first of all, I do like the way that Branagh structured this part of the story, where it is very mysterious. We don't know that it's Thor. We don't know it's Chris Hemsworth. I mean, we don't know anything other than it was a shadowy figure that they struck with their vehicle. And I think that's very creative, the way that they kind of allow that potential mystery of who this was that they actually hit with their vehicle. I find that to be just an interesting way to approach it. And the fact we don't see him, what we see is her reaction. And I love the way you described it because, first of all, it's Natalie Portman. I mean, it's just a beautiful shot of her with her beautiful face as she looks at him. But it's just her, and it's her face lit with the flashlights. It's such an interesting way to light it. It's a beautifully created shot that allows us to see her kind of almost taking a breath in surprise at what she has discovered here. And I find that she's clearly taken. And I find that to be a pretty interesting way to kind of approach this moment.
Now, one thing I thought that was interesting, and you pointed this out, is if Erik is sort of the parent here, you'd think that this would be the moment where he would speak up and be like, okay, you two need to calm down because your fighting just meant we might have killed somebody here.
Yeah.
Does he say a word during the scene?
He doesn't say anything. When we see this scene continue, he will have some things that he does say, but at this particular point, there's nothing. And I mean, he's scripted saying things, but the way that they put it together, there's nothing from him.
Which I think is definitely very interesting.
Yeah.
So then we have that beautiful moment, and then we go into, again, a little bit of, early credits. Once again, it's Paramount and Marvel. Enjoy that now. That's not going to stick around for long. Anything kind of just in terms of the way that's done grab you about the way that the quick opening credits moment to transition?
Well, I think that it's a moment where, again, it's kind of like a beat. You're right. We're getting a beat here, a break of this story, which ends on her question, which I love. Where did he come from? I think that's a great question that we have. And then you have this kind of soft boom sound that's kind of like boom. It's real soft, but it's like this clear sound you can hear as we cut to black. It's kind of like the mic drop sort of moment. We come up on the Paramount Pictures. We actually get Marvel twice. We get Paramount Pictures and Marvel Entertainment, and then we get a Marvel Studios production. So you're kind of getting the sense of the two different Marvel families behind all of this. But I like that it sets the stage there for what we're stepping into here, which is this flashback. It is this moment. And so, I don't know, it felt like a nice moment to allow for that question to roll for a moment as we ourselves were asking that.
Right. Because in some regard, what you basically get is she asks the question. And what she means is like, where was he 10 seconds ago? Why is he here now? But obviously there's a much deeper answer to the question. And we're sort of getting Odin saying oh, you want to answer the question? Well, okay, let me tell you the answer to that question, but I need to go back to the very beginning, And often moments like that, I can have a sort of bit of an eye roll to the director of okay, I see what you did there. You're trying to be cute. That moment totally worked because you get that little boom. You get that just moment of the credits and a little bit, again, the sort of soft building music. And then Odin starts telling the story. It just felt to me like it was a transition that really worked because it's now we're back into this other time. We're back into this magical realm that is completely different from science, but we do know it's going to be scientifically explained. But you had that transition. And I just love the way they put that together.
I completely agree with your point. It's really interesting. It's interesting how it's scripted. Let me just read this because it's actually Heimdall who pops in here. We don't get a flashback to Tonsberg, Norway, 965. Let me just read what Heimdall says. And actually, I was wrong earlier. This was the place where we would have had what we see over the end credits of the film, where we see the stars, we see kind of all these galaxies, and then we kind of pull out and we see Yggdrasil in space. That's basically what happens while Heimdall has this voiceover. Questions. They've always asked questions, this race called man, on this planet they call Earth, passionately longing to know how they are connected to the heavens. In ages past, they looked to us as gods, for indeed so many times we saved them from calamity. We tried to show them how their world was but one of the 9 realms of the cosmos, linked to all others by the branches of Yggdrasil, the world's tree. 9 realms in a universe of wonder, beauty, and terror that they barely comprehended. But for all their thirst for knowledge, they let our lessons fall into myth and dreams. Where did he come from? He came from us, the proudest race of warriors the worlds have ever seen. He came from this, the greatest realm the universe has ever known. We move through the galaxy's mists and astral matter, over and up through a band of prismatic color to reveal what's on the other side. Then Heimdall kicks in again. He came from Asgard. So that would have kind of eliminated this entire flashback, and we would have gone straight through the cosmos, up through Yggdrasil into Asgard. It's an interesting perspective to kind of take that route. It's fine, but when I see this setting of the story, one, we get a sense of the Frost Giants, which we don't get through any of that. It gives us kind of a sense of history, and from my perspective, I really appreciate that.
I have mixed feelings when I read this because, I'll just say the one reason why I like this, and a little part of me wishes something of it had been in the script, is I realize you're going to be listening to this sometime after we recorded it. But at the time of recording it, I've recently seen the Suicide Squad movie. And so with that in mind, it reminds me that Idris Elba was criminally underused in, I think, the entire Thor franchise. To me, it's the single biggest complaint I maybe have about this movie is that he is just such a phenomenal actor who doesn't get enough to do. And so part of me is like, yeah, give him more to say. That would have been great. But like, you know how I just said that I think sometimes directors can be too cute with the whole, like, Jane asked this question, but really it's this question. This is exactly what I meant. This here, I feel like the writer was exactly doing the too cute thing I meant. Like, when Heimdall literally answers the question, I'm like, oh, come on. Like, we're not 8 years old here.
I know.
Nothing wrong with an 8-year-old watching the movie, but you know what I mean.
Yep. Right,
so I do feel like it's interesting that they changed it, and I like that we get more of the Yggdrasil stuff, because as we'll talk later, that stuff is straight out of Norse mythology. Like, a lot of this is the Thor of the comic books, which is not Thor of, you know, it's two Jewish guys from New York writing the story. It's not Norse history being written into comic books. But this moment is very much taken, so I like that part of it. But overall, I think this is a big improvement to do it the way they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as you mentioned, we do have Odin Allfather, who is doing the voiceover here. That's Anthony Hopkins. If you were to guess what 4 films would pop up on IMDb for old Anthony Hopkins, or should I say Sir Anthony Hopkins, I believe he has been knighted, any ideas?
So I have to start with the thing that introduced me to Anthony Hopkins, which is Silence of the Lambs. Mm-hmm. I didn't know much about him before then. I think I was maybe like 13 years old. But so that's going to be my first. And I do think that's still considered one of his sort of foundational movies. There's some ridiculous thing he made with Nicolas Cage about him flying through the air, and I think someone just looked like him in that. I don't know, but it definitely, I have no idea what that movie was, but it's definitely not that. My mother was a huge period piece person. So I feel there's a movie, I think it's Remains of the Day, but it's a Ivory Merchant movie where he plays, so like, you know, I know that he was the father figure in the movie that every teenage girl I knew went absolutely crazy about, because it was Brad Pitt and someone else in World War I, and Anthony Hopkins was the father.
Legends of the Fall. Yep.
Legend of the Fall, thank you. I think Remains of the Day was the Ivory Merchant, like, Edwardian period piece that I never saw, but I know that's very popular.
Yeah.
And I just feel like he's done so much else since then. I'm trying to remember what else he's done. It's not a movie, but a TV show. Westworld, I think, was one of the things that he's done that he had a very big part in. And so I think maybe... So I'm going to say Silence of the Lambs. I'm going to say Westworld. And then maybe Remains of the Day and Legend of the Fall. But those two less likely. Those are just the only two I can think of.
Well, I mean, he's just finished a film which will be his 84th film that he's been in, not to mention his TV credits. He's got 50 TV credits. So he is a very busy actor. He was at a point in his career where he seemed like he was going to retire, but then he just keeps working. And I love that. And he just won an Oscar last year for The Father, which was a fantastic performance in that film, if you haven't seen it yet. But according to IMDb, the 4 films that Anthony Hopkins is known for, you were right. The Silence of the Lambs is number 1. And that would be exactly what I would say as my number 1 also, because, that certainly was where I first really came to know him. The second one was when he played Alfred Hitchcock in the film Hitchcock, which was all about the production of Psycho. The third film, which is a very, again, obscure one, was The World's Fastest Indian, where he's riding one of the Indian motorbikes across the desert.
Can I quick change my vote for number 4?
Okay, sure. What's number 4?
I'm wondering if maybe it's Nixon, because I know he played Richard Nixon in that movie.
He did play Richard Nixon in Oliver Stone's film, but that wasn't it. If you had gone a much softer route, not quite so Oliver Stone, but more maybe Steven Spielberg, and you went with Amistad, where he played John Quincy Adams, then you would have been right.
Oh, okay.
And now we have a crossover. He and Stellan Skarsgård both appeared in Amistad.
There you go. And I have to say, if I don't get Idris Elba's voice reading exposition to me, Anthony Hopkins is like, it's not a step down. Like,
certainly.
If you want to talk about 2 great English actors with fantastic voices, and I know The Wire had been made before this, but I feel like The Wire, I think, is another thing that is criminally unknown in terms of how few people have seen it. Personally, I think it's one of the best TV shows ever made. And so it's going to be fun. When we get Heimdall on screen, we can talk about this more. My sense, though, is that Idris Elba wasn't really a household name the way Anthony Hopkins was. So that may also be part of like why they give these lines to Odin instead.
That could be entirely possible. Also, I mean, I will say, even though Heimdall is kind of the all-seeing that we have in the story, who's guarding the Bifrost, he runs the observatory, like he sees all, which I really like about that. I kind of, because the way he's portrayed in the film as being such a stoic, I have a hard time seeing him kind of having these sorts of speeches where it makes sense for me coming from somebody like the king himself, Odin. So I can see that playing out a little more the way they chose to do it.
Especially because I have to say, I don't love the way they frame the humanity Asgardian relationship in this, in that it's really playing into that. First of all, there's a thing in science fiction that comes up of like human exceptionalism, where humans are always like so fascinating because we have all these questions and we are so curious and we always want to know everything about the world. And I sort of wonder, like, why do we think other alien races don't have that, But more, the Heimdall speech goes so far into this idea of, the humans always have to be like saved by the Asgardians. And isn't it this terrible thing that like they've forgotten all that we've taught them? What actually happens from Hopkins is so much more subtle, where Odin just says, once mankind accepted a simple truth that they were not alone in this universe. Some worlds man believed to be home to their gods, others they knew to fear. And to me, that's such a broader view of the universe, because then it's not now just like the Asgardians and the humans and like nothing else was out there, but also it's just much more subtle. And I just like that framing. I think that setup works a lot better for this world.
Yeah, I think that it's really nice, the way that it sounds. And this, I think we're going to be talking a lot about the nature of Asgardians as they fit into kind of our stories and everything. And I will have some questions, because there's something I think that Anthony Hopkins will say in the next minute as kind of a continuation of this speech that I do have a little bit more of a question about. But largely, I think it is really interesting the way that it sets it up, where, they're just other beings that are out there, and we all kind of share this space. We've just kind of forgotten that.
Right.
Yeah. I want to bring something up, and I think this is an interesting thing that the filmmakers chose to do. And especially I'm curious from your perspective, being somebody who has kind of a theological background. We get the title coming up on the screen as we're introduced to our location here. It's Tonsberg, Norway, 965 AD. Now, we'll talk about Tonsberg here in a moment, but I want to talk right now about this 965 AD. I find it interesting that in this story, this particular story about these other beings that we might have seen as mythological gods or something, that they're actually using the AD designation, because AD is a very Christian-based designation. The whole BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini. The fact that they're using that instead of something like CE, which has become it's the more non-religious or more interfaith kind of way that you would designate a year these days. Now, I know AD is much more easy. Like I think for a lot of people, the BC AD designation it's a clear thing that you see on screen. So perhaps they just didn't even think about it. They just kind of put it there because that's what they've always put. But I do find it interesting in the story about gods, in a story about is it the Christian-based world with God still as God in a story about gods?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, especially because when I hear this discussion, the immediate thing I think of is the line from Avengers where Natasha warns Steve Rogers, you're up against a god. And he says, there's only one God, ma'am, and he doesn't dress like that.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of an interesting, it's Steve Rogers saying that he's still a believing Christian or monotheist, but it seemed kind of like the universe. It's kind of like the writers being like, no, there is a God, but it's not all these Norse gods, Here again, I wonder, kind of like the discussion we had a while ago about, is New Mexico the best story choice, or is it cheaper?
Yeah.
I know that Marvel, especially at this point, was very, very careful to not offend people. And they always wanted to have as broad an audience as possible. And so when I look at that, my memory of what things were like 11 years ago is not perfect, but my memory is that I remember when I was doing academic work, only about 5 years before then, we were all told not to use AD, but that felt like a fairly recent shift. And and that was in like kind of super progressive academia. So I would actually, I think for me, it is an interesting point. Well, I think there's kind of three things I would say. One is that to the people of Tonsberg, Norway at the time, it is very much AD. And so perhaps there would be like, the records that this comes from, they would call it AD. A second thing is I think there could be an interesting theological point they're trying to make of like, we're still using that calendar and those gods fit, and kind of a reminder of like, this is still a world in which the Christian God is the thing people believe in, although not in Norway at that time. Well, actually, no, I take all that back because at this point in time, Norway hadn't been Christianized. So yeah, those people would definitely not be using AD. So ignore that point entirely. And those of you who are already halfway through typing out angry emails, perhaps you can, hear that I've adjusted it. Though, please send that because I'm a raging egotist, so I want any kind of interaction from you all. But honestly, I'm going to say the biggest thing that I would think is that it was Marvel sort of having just this like, why rock the boat? That's some people are, some angry church is going to be like, oh, Marvel is all. I think, and actually, the more I think of it, I did remember reading. I've read a couple of biographies of Stan Lee, and one of the things that he talks about when he was creating Thor was that there was somewhat in the back of their mind, like, the Comics Code of America was still a thing when Thor was being written, which for those who don't know, like there was a lot of censorship of comics, and a lot of like comics have to tell like good, wholesome American stories. And he kind of like, he briefly mentions it. He doesn't go into much detail, but he says like, he wasn't really sure how like Christian middle America would respond to a story about a pagan god, a Norse god. And so I do think that ethos has always been a little bit in the back of people's minds. Now, as we get into more, Stan Lee had nothing to do with the writing of this movie. But by this point, he's totally disconnected from all these movies. But I guess to me, that would be my guess. If I see AD, I don't think they're trying to make a theological point. I think they're trying not to anger people.
You're probably right. And I think the part of that is also they just didn't even think about it. It didn't cross their mind. But I do think that there's probably just some level of, as a company, we're just going to play it safe and put it this way just because it's less likely to create any sort of internet controversy. And that is certainly something that, they do consider, as we've come to learn over the course of this kind of the continuation of this franchise, and when people might say something that is controversial and they fire them and things like that. I mean, it certainly is something that does happen. They do like to avoid controversy.
Again, having just watched the movie James Gunn did while he wasn't making Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Yeah. Let's talk not just the AD, but Tonsberg, Norway winds up becoming a very important town in the MCU.
Right.
What else happens here?
Well, it's just so interesting. And first of all, just to point out that Tonsberg should be written with the slashed O for the TO. It should have that slash in it, which they will actually correct in subsequent films, which I think is funny. But I mean, yeah, it is kind of it is, first of all, it is a real place in Norway. Generally regarded the oldest city in Norway, founded by the Vikings in the 9th century. So to that end, like, they're doing everything right as far as what they're putting on the screen here, 965 AD. Sure, it all sounds just right. But other than that, they pretty much fictionalize the place. They don't even film in Norway. When we do see it in later films, it's Scotland, I think, where they're always filming. Regardless, we have a setting here. We will next see it in Captain America because it happens to be where Red Skull comes to find the Tesseract. There's debate about in Thor Ragnarok if when we see Odin kind of on that green hill, if that's actually Tonsberg, but he does say, maybe you'll settle here. So people have largely thought, oh, well, maybe it's Tonsberg. And then last but not least, of course, is Endgame, when we see where Thor has been hanging out. And eventually he and Valkyrie kind of settle as the new Asgard.
New Asgard. Yeah, which we'll get into more later, but I when you talked about the sort of new Asgard they built over Oklahoma, I kind of wonder how similar that is to what gets built in Tonsberg.
To me, it's floating over Oklahoma, so I'd say it's a little bit different. Yeah, it's like a giant castle. Yeah,
that's awesome. And to me, I think it's very interesting because, especially to me, knowing that there's just all these connections between Asgard and this one very specific part of Scandinavia, what is today Norway. It does make me feel like kind of Odin in that moment was like, no, I'm sending you to Midgard, but I'm not even just sending you to like the place where we all know. I'm sending you to like the very furthest thing you could have from like frost and Scandinavians, and we're sending you to New Mexico. So that I think is kind of a fun moment. In Tonsberg, we do meet a couple of characters who very quickly have a bad end before they get to speak or really have an impact, but there's certainly two of them have a very powerful visual shot. Who do we meet in Tonsberg?
Yeah, this is as we're kind of meeting some of these early Vikings, these Norwegians and everything. The camera just lingers. I mean, there are a number of them, and some of them are credited, some of them aren't. There's a Viking elder, Alexander Wright. I have no idea which one he is. It's so dark in this particular scene. A number of other Vikings, but we very specifically focus on a Viking mother and a Viking child. Carrie Lazar plays the Viking mother, and Harley Graham plays this little Viking child. And if anything, I would say that, again, it's a kind of a filmmaking technique, storytelling technique, where we have Odin describing this situation and setting us up, but the camera moves in on these two to allow us to find somebody to identify with in this particular moment of the story.
Yeah, so we only get a couple cuts of that. We only get a couple moments of them on screen, and we'll get two of them, as you said, are kind of have a bigger role in the next minute. But I think it's a nice way, again, of it's easy to tell a story about, like, this thing happened to 10,000 people. But still, when you give a human face to the people we're talking about here, I think that's really powerful.
Well, and it comes right at a moment in Odin's speech where he's talking about, as you already read, some worlds man believed to be home to their gods. And now we're seeing the mother and girl as they're looking up to the sky. And he says others they knew to fear. And so we're like, I mean, the way the story is leading, okay, something that is scary is coming. Like, that's kind of what's happening here, right?
Right, definitely. So, and I talked a few minutes ago about that sort of feeling like we're now going back into but sometimes science can like lead you to forget things instead of learning things. Did you feel like that? Am I just kind of reading too much into that? Or did you feel there was an interesting dichotomy there of Odin sort of talking about this time when man knew things because we hadn't yet scientifically proven that other worlds weren't populated or things like that?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like at this particular point, like the people he's talking about were people who accepted this simple truth that they weren't alone and that they believed there were gods and they believed, we've got to be afraid of some of this stuff. As it so happens, the people who are coming right now are ones we should be afraid of, right? So they're completely in that space where I guess you would say, the rest of humanity will be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the next couple films. Like by the time we're done with the Avengers, I'd say that humanity largely is back in this space.
Sure. And I just meant, I feel like to me the implication is, and this is even more true in what Heimdall says about where specifically calls out they've forgotten. But I felt like even in Odin, part of what the implication is humanity used to know this, but they forgot.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And so there's a little bit of a like, the moving away from the myths isn't always, a move towards truth.
Well, did they forget or were they all frozen?
Well, I mean, also possibly true. Also possibly true. Yeah. I think so much of this scene sets up a lot of things that's going to come in just literally the next minute. So this might be a good time to kind of start wrapping up. Are there any other kind of big things from this specific minute you want to get into?
Just the fact that, we're also introducing another piece of Patrick Doyle's music, which is always great. And I just love hearing Patrick Doyle's music. So yes, the prologue music is kicking in and it's just lovely. So, but that's it. Otherwise, I think we kind of, hit all the big points in this minute.
There are moments where the music feels like its own separate thing. In this moment, especially, to me, what it feels like is that Anthony Hopkins' speech is a spoken word performance with musical background. I mean, the score and his speech just are so perfectly paired together that it really felt to me like just one and the same.
Yeah, absolutely. The only last thing that I'd say, just to call out the people who are credited as Vikings, we have Hilary Pingle, Sean Colin Young, Kinsey McLean, Kelly Hawthorne, and then uncredited, there's also Vanessa Bednar and Michelle Cetos. So they're all out there, somewhere in the dark running around from the ice.
One thing that Marvel has done has kind of taught us as audiences to respect the credits more. The credits used to always be the time where I was like putting on my coat, I was seeing how much popcorn I'd knocked over and trying to clean that up and getting ready to talk to my friends about what'd you like about the movie. And I think in part they just wanted to, have a little bit more movie making with all the post-credit scenes. But I think one effect of that is that now we've all sat through an awful lot more credit scenes than at least I ever used to. And I know one of our guests is going to come on towards the end, specifically asked to be on the credits because his family, both his parents, were in movie making. So I really appreciate that we're naming all those people, because I think that's kind of part of the MCU idea is like, we shouldn't just think about the top credit people. Like, let's pay attention to all of the literally hundreds of people who worked to make this movie happen.
Oh, yeah. Lots and lots of people. So kudos to all of them for the work that they've put into this.
Yeah, and so all those people deserve credit. And, you know, in terms of this podcast, this podcast happens because of you who listen, those of you who subscribe. So kudos to all of you. Thank you all for your support, and have a great day.
Until next time, true believers.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM, engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is One Last Ride by Martin Puringer. Find the show at truestory.fm. And if your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, consider doing that for this show.